In 1997, a judge cut off a 16-year-old girl's microphone mid-song and told her she had no future in music. The man sitting in the back row of that auditorium stood up. Nobody in the room knew who he was yet, but they were about to find out. Nashville, Tennessee has always been a city that runs on dreams. Every year, thousands of young singers pour into its streets carrying nothing but their voices and the unshakable belief that music will find a way to carry them somewhere better than where they started. Most of those dreams go quiet eventually, absorbed into the noise of a city that has heard everything and is rarely surprised. But every so often, something happens in Nashville that reminds everyone why the dream existed in the first place. Something that cuts through the noise and lands with the kind of clarity that people remember for the rest of their lives. On the evening of March 14, 1997, that something happened in a 300-seat auditorium on the second floor of the Millbrook Community Center on the east side of Nashville. The occasion was the third annual Rising Star Regional Talent Competition, a modestly funded contest that had been running since 1995 with the goal of identifying undiscovered musical talent in the surrounding counties. The prize was $2,000 and a recording session at a small Nashville studio. It was not the Grammys. It was not a major television broadcast. It was exactly the kind of event that happens in hundreds of cities every year without anyone outside the building ever knowing it occurred. Except that on this particular evening, one of the people in the audience was Lionel Richie. He had not come to be recognized. He had come because his tour manager's niece was performing that night, and his tour manager, a man named Gerald Beaumont, who had worked with Lionel for 11 years, had mentioned it in passing over dinner 3 nights earlier. Lionel had no particular reason to attend, and every reason not to. He was in Nashville for a series of production meetings that had run long, he was tired, and a 300-seat community center auditorium was not where most people in his position spent their Tuesday evenings. But something about the way Gerald had mentioned it, careful and quiet, the way people mention things they don't want to ask for directly, had stayed with Lionel. He had told Gerald to save him a seat. He arrived late, slipping in through a side door just as the 4th contestant was finishing her set, and found his way to row 7, seat 14, in the back half of the auditorium, where the lighting was dim enough that he could sit without being immediately noticed.
Maya Collins was the 7th contestant of the evening. She was 16 years old, from a town called Greer in Spartanburg County, South Carolina, and she had driven to Nashville that day in a 1989 Honda Civic with her mother, Patricia Collins, who worked double shifts at a textile plant outside Greenville and had taken 2 days off without pay to make the trip possible. Maya had been singing since she was 5 years old. She had performed in her church choir, in school talent shows, and at every community event in Greer that would have her. She had never performed in front of a professional panel. She had never been in Nashville before that day. She had spent the 6-hour drive running through her chosen song in her head, going over the phrasing and the breathing and the moments where she knew her voice did something that she couldn't fully explain but could always feel, a kind of opening, like a window coming up, where the sound became something larger than herself. The song she had chosen was Hello. She had chosen it because it was the song that had taught her what singing could be. She had heard it for the first time at age 7 on a cassette tape that her grandmother kept in the kitchen, and she had stood in that kitchen completely still for 4 minutes and 17 seconds while the song played, aware even then that something in the music was asking something of her that she didn't yet have the words to describe. She had spent the next 9 years learning how to answer that question. Hello was not a safe choice for a competition. It was a song that had been performed thousands of times by thousands of singers, and most panels had heard every version imaginable. Choosing it required something beyond technical ability. It required the performer to find something in the song that justified performing it again, to locate a truth inside it that was specific enough to be new. Maya Collins walked onto the stage of the Millbrook Community Center Auditorium at 8:47 in the evening. She was wearing a blue dress that her mother had altered the night before to fit properly. She had no backing band, just a track playing through the house system and her voice. She stepped to the microphone, looked out at the 300 people in the seats, and began to sing. What happened in the next 90 seconds was something that several people who were present that evening would later struggle to describe accurately, not because it was difficult to remember, but because it was difficult to translate into language. Maya Collins sang the opening verse of Hello with a quality that the room had not been expecting from a 16-year-old in a blue dress from South Carolina. It was not a perfect technical performance. Her breath support on the long phrases was inconsistent in the way that young singers' breath support often is. There were moments where the pitch moved slightly off-center before correcting itself. But underneath all of that, underneath every imperfection, there was something that technical analysis cannot fully account for, a quality of genuine feeling that made the song sound like it was being sung for the first time, like the words meant exactly what they said and the person saying them understood why.
In row 7, seat 14, Lionel Richie stopped breathing. He had heard his own song performed by some of the greatest singers alive. He had heard it in stadiums and concert halls and television studios and every context imaginable. He thought he knew every version of Hello that was possible. What he was hearing from the stage of a community center in Nashville on a Tuesday night was not a version he had heard before. It was the version he had been trying to write when he wrote it. The version that existed in his head before it became a recording, before it became a hit, before it became the song that everyone knew. It was Hello stripped of everything that had accumulated around it over the years, returned to the simple human truth at its center. He was still processing this when the music stopped. Not because Maya had finished. She was 40 seconds from the end of the song, in the middle of the final chorus, when the panel's head judge, a man named Richard Calloway, who had worked in music industry management for 22 years and had the particular confidence of someone who had spent 2 decades being told his opinions were correct, reached forward and pressed the button that cut the microphone feed to the stage. The room went silent in the wrong way. Not the silence of a held breath, but the silence of something interrupted. Maya Collins stood at the center of the stage with her mouth still slightly open, the last note dissolved into nothing, looking out at the panel table with an expression that moved through confusion and then understanding and then something harder to watch than either of those things. Richard Calloway leaned into his own microphone. His voice was the measured, unhurried voice of someone who has delivered verdicts many times and no longer considers their weight. "Thank you," he said. "Technically competent, but we're not hearing emotional connection. The song requires something you're not able to access at this stage. You might consider working on your interpretive range before your next competition." The auditorium produced the uncomfortable murmur of 300 people who had just witnessed something they didn't know how to respond to. Maya Collins nodded once, the way people nod when they are trying to not let their face do what their face wants to do, and turned to walk off the stage. In row 7, seat 14, Lionel Richie stood up. Gerald Beaumont, sitting 2 seats away, noticed immediately and leaned over. "Lionel," his voice was low and careful, "what are you doing?" Lionel didn't answer. He was already moving toward the aisle. The security volunteer near the stage door, a 23-year-old named Travis who was volunteering his Tuesday evening and had not anticipated this being a complicated assignment, stepped forward with his hand up as Lionel approached. "Sir, contestants and authorized personnel only past this—" "That's all right," Lionel said quietly. He said it the way people say things when they are very calm and have already decided what is going to happen next. Travis, to his credit, later said that there was something in the voice that made him step aside without being entirely sure why.
Lionel Richie walked onto the stage of the Millbrook Community Center. Maya Collins, who had been 3 steps from the exit, turned around at the sound of footsteps and found herself looking at a man she recognized with the particular disorientation of seeing someone famous in a context that makes no sense. Lionel took the microphone from the stand, looked at it for a moment, and then looked at the panel table where Richard Calloway was sitting, with an expression that had shifted from authority to uncertainty. "I'd like to respond to your assessment," Lionel said. His voice was carrying through the house system now, and the auditorium had gone completely still. "My name is Lionel Richie. I wrote that song." He paused. "The one you just cut off." The 300 people in the auditorium produced a sound that was not quite a gasp and not quite silence, but something between the two. Richard Calloway's expression completed its journey from uncertainty to something that had no comfortable name. "This young woman," Lionel continued, turning slightly toward Maya, who was standing completely motionless, "just sang the truest version of that song I have heard since I wrote it. She didn't sing it the way it was recorded. She didn't sing it the way it's been performed 1,000 times. She sang it the way I heard it in my head before it existed. And you cut her off 40 seconds from the end." He looked back at the panel. "I'm curious what emotional connection sounds like to you, because what I heard from this stage sounded like the real thing to me." Richard Calloway opened his mouth. What came out was a professionally constructed response about judging criteria and technical standards that dissolved into the auditorium air without leaving any impression, because nobody in the room was listening to it. Lionel turned to Maya. She was 17 inches away from him, and she appeared to be operating on some frequency beyond normal human processing. "Would you finish the song?" he asked her. "With me?" Maya Collins sang the final 40 seconds of Hello on the stage of the Millbrook Community Center with Lionel Richie standing beside her. He did not overshadow her. He did not turn it into his performance. He harmonized quietly beneath her lead, the way a more experienced musician supports a younger one, present enough to steady, restrained enough to let the younger voice remain the one the room was hearing. When the last note ended, the 300 people in the auditorium stood up. Maya Collins did not win the Rising Star Regional Talent Competition that evening. The judging criteria had been established before the night began, and Richard Calloway was not a man who revised his assessments publicly. The prize went to a 22-year-old guitarist from Knoxville who played a competent set and offended no one.
But before Lionel left the building, he spent 40 minutes in a small green room backstage with Maya and her mother Patricia, talking about Maya's voice, her training, her plans, and what she needed next. He gave Gerald Beaumont's contact information to Patricia and asked Gerald directly in front of both of them to follow up within the week. He told Maya that what she had was not something that could be taught and not something that judging criteria could accurately measure. He told her that the people who would eventually recognize it were the right people, and that her job was to keep singing until she found them. Patricia Collins drove back to Greer the following morning with her daughter and $2,000 less than she had hoped for. What she had instead was a phone number, a promise, and the memory of watching 300 strangers stand up for her daughter in a community center auditorium in Nashville on a Tuesday night. Gerald Beaumont called within the week, as promised. The introduction he facilitated led to a series of further introductions, each one opening a door that the previous one had made visible. Maya Collins spent the next 3 years developing her voice with coaches whose names she had previously only seen in album liner notes.
In 2001, she released her first record on an independent label with production support that traced directly back to that Tuesday evening in Nashville. The album did not transform the charts overnight. What it did was establish her name among people in the industry who paid attention to voices that did something real. And those people told other people, and the circle widened in the way that genuine talent widens circles when it finally has the room to move. Richard Calloway's assessment of her emotional range was not widely remembered. What was remembered by everyone who had been in that auditorium and by everyone they told, which turned out to be a considerable number of people, was the sound of 300 strangers getting to their feet because a 16-year-old girl from South Carolina had sung 40 seconds of a song with the man who wrote it and made the whole room feel something true. Lionel Richie, when asked about that evening in a later interview, said that he had not planned any of it and would not have been able to explain, if asked in advance, why he stood up. "You stand up," he said, "because sitting down stops being possible. That's the only way I know how to describe it." He paused. "She sang my song back to me, and I heard something in it I had forgotten was there. That's not something you stay in your seat for." Maya Collins still performs. She opens every show with Hello. Not as a tribute and not as a story. Audiences who don't know the history simply hear a singer who has chosen a well-known song and made it entirely her own. But the people who know the story understand that the song carries more weight than most songs carry, having been the instrument of a moment that proved something worth proving, that the people who decide what talent looks like are sometimes wrong, and that the people who stand up to say so are sometimes sitting in row 7, seat 14, on a Tuesday night in Nashville when nobody knew they were there. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit the like button. Share this with someone who's been told their dream isn't good enough, because sometimes the person who recognizes your voice is already in the room. Leave a comment below. Have you ever witnessed a moment when someone stood up for a talent the world almost missed? And don't forget to ring the notification bell for more stories about the moments when music finds the people who need it most, and the people who are brave enough to make sure it does.